Okay, welcome to VDEV, everybody. I'm gonna, before we get started with Marcela Eslava, who will be talking about jobless industrialization, let me first welcome Marcela and Laura, her co-author, to join us at this VDEV. And for those of you who are new to our forum, just a little bit the rules of the game. So Marcela will present for 45 minutes. During those 45 minutes, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. Laura will be answering those that you can in writing at that point. There may also be a few questions at certain points during the 45 minutes that I'll ask Marcela directly. And then after the 45 minutes, there is another 15 minutes of open questions where we can open your mic so you can raise your hands and we can have a discussion as on the topics that come up. The seminar is being recorded, as you heard when you logged on. It will be available on the YouTube channel afterwards. So if you want to flag it to other people, feel free to do so. Obviously, abuse of the seminar will not be tolerated, but I don't expect any problems with that. And I think that's the most important things I needed to say, other than being excited and to give the word to Marcela. And so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Let me see. Are you now seeing my screen? Good. Great. Okay, so let me start by thanking the organizers. I'm thrilled to be here. Super happy to join this great seminar. So I'll be presenting this joint work with Laurel Farah, who, as Karen said, is here and maybe able to answer some of your questions in the chat, with Felipe Sanz in South Carolina, and Martín Mestieri, who's at Pompeu Fabra, the Barcelona School of Economics, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And of course, the usual disclaimer for Fed employees applies in the case of Martín. So this is a paper where we tackle one angle of the development problem as illuminated by the process of industrialization. And our focus is not so much on the fact that these developed economies today industrialized late, or that they deindustrialized rapidly, or that they did not industrialized as much as their today developed counterparts, which has been sort of the focus of the discussion. But on this fact that we advance and that we call jobless industrialization. It is the fact that these late starters, most of which are today less developed economies, exhibited a divorce between the importance that manufacturing, the modern sector had in the economy, a divorce between that importance as represented in terms of value added, the participation here of manufacturing in total value added in the economy, vis-a-vis the importance of manufacturing in employment in the economy. That divorce was not a feature of the peak of industrialization in early starters. For those countries, the share that manufacturing represented in total employment was similar to the share it represented in value added, whereas in late starters, notice interestingly that actually in terms of value added, manufacturing reached a share in terms of total value added that was not that different from that in early starters. But it is in employment where you see that huge difference. And these are big numbers, 26% at this peak compared to something around 17% at the peak. That's, of course, a worrisome phenomenon to the extent that you think, for instance, that the creation of the middle class depends on getting people into the modern sector. Let me also mention that this is quite prevalent across regions. So if you look at Latin America, Asia, Africa, which of course Africa arguably didn't industrialize at all, but all of these countries exhibited at the peak of industrialization or the largest industrialization period, an important divorce between the shares of employment versus value added that manufacturing represented, whereas in Great Britain, in the United States, you don't see that feature at all at the peak of industrialization. In continental Europe, you see it very, very dampened. And if you split continental Europe between late and early starters, it is only late starters that exhibit some degree of divorce. Now we advance a second fact that's very related to this, and it is the relationship between this divorce and the characteristics of the size distribution of firms. Let me show it here. What you have in this graph is for the peak of industrialization. Again, the vertical axis represents the divorce. So it's the share of manufacturing and employment relative to value added in the economy, such that countries that are low in the y-axis are countries with large joblessness or jobless industrialization. And the y-axis has the share within manufacturing, the share within manufacturing employment that the larger firms represent. Here, the larger firms are all the firms in this Instat database, which are mostly firms above 10 employees. So this is not the big corporations, but it is the larger firms. It excludes micro enterprises and self-employment. So what that means, what this graph shows is that there is a very tight correlation between lack of modern firms and joblessness. And that is despite the fact that it is the larger firms in any economy that generally exhibit more joblessness. So here, for the case of Colombia, in these two first columns, for the case of the the USA, what we're showing is the ratio of the weight that these firms have in employment relative to value. And what you can see is that ratio is smaller in the larger firms in any of this sample. So this is a database that only has firms beyond 10 employees. This is the overall household survey with all the employees in the economy, all the workers in an economy. And what you can see is the smaller the firm, the larger, or the set of firms, the larger the weight in employment relative to value. So, so it is these two facts that we find intriguing, problematic for development, and that motivate our research here. In particular, what we do in this paper is explore a hypothesis and contrast it with others. One hypothesis that has been quite prominent in the policy discussion in Latin America in particular, and that we think may be important for other economies as well. Oops, I just realized I didn't initiate my clock, so let me put it up. So that feature of the discussion is the idea that, of course, this is something specific to employment or specific to employment relative to value. And it is the idea that perhaps the difference between early and late starters is that early starters started their industrialization process at a point in time where working conditions and wages were low. And it was only gradually that wages increased, labor regulation was put in place, and these economies and the firms in these modern sectors started to provide worker protection. Whereas the late starters came into the process not only at a point where labor-saving technologies were more available, but also when it was no longer acceptable to not offer labor protection, but also a time when these economies had precisely not industrialized sufficiently and not developed sufficiently, that their productivity levels were at a point that were fully compatible with the levels of labor protection that societies were expecting at that point. As I said, this is not simply something that we're coming up with. It's very prevalent part of the discussion today. That has to do with the fact that this joblessness was not only a feature of the peak of industrialization, but extends to today. The prevalence of backward firm, mostly informal or in the form of informal employment, is also prominent in these countries today, particularly in LATAM, where I'll be focusing today. Linked to the feeble development of the middle class and to problems of today, such as the income and the productivity gap, vis-a-vis the advanced economies. So these features are prevalent today, and they relate to debates that relate to the hypothesis that I was mentioning. In particular, much of the literature from the macro side on the development problem has focused on the idea that there are idiosyncratic distortions that affect different firms differentially, and so could be related to the differential patterns across firms that I was showing. Some of the findings precisely relate to distortions in the labor market, and from that literature, part of the recommendations that arise have to do with flexibilization in different margins of distortions. One of them being particularly the labor market. But also in the policy arena, there have been influential policy recommendations suggesting that the explanations for all these phenomena that I was mentioning here in the first point, in the first bullet point of this slide, may lay in dysfunctional social protection. Dysfunctional in the sense that it is directly linked, social protection directly linked to labor protection, therefore linked to only formal workers in economies that actually have very large prevalence of informality, and dysfunctional also in the sense that not only the workers that are protected are usually the formal workers, but also that the funding for social protection is tied to contributions on formal jobs. And based on that assessment, some recommend transiting to social protection, delinked from formal employment, from modern employment. And so that's the debate in which we want to contribute. And in particular, we want to explore how plausible is that sort of explanation vis-a-vis other explanations, other distortions that people have looked at, given the distributions of productivity that we see in the population of businesses in the economy. And I am purposely using the word businesses rather than firms to make sure that I signal the fact that a very important feature of our research is that we're covering all of the productive sector, all of the employment in the productive sector, including self-employment, micro-enterprises, and in general linked to those two phenomena, informality. So to explore how plausible that hypothesis is, we built a general equilibrium model of the structure of the economy across sectors and types of firms, what we will call modern versus backward firms linked to those sectors, to evaluate the potential of different distortions that affect mostly formal, that is also modern product and input markets. And that input markets includes the labor market. And we evaluate that potential to generate jobless manufacturing and the polarization of jobless manufacturing that we showed in the data. And what we do as well is to inform the model with very detailed historical data from, in particular, Colombia, on the distribution of abilities in the overall working population and the distribution of distortions that we can identify across modern firms. So that's the purpose of the paper. As I said, one innovative feature is the exploration of very detailed historical data. This is very much work in progress, and part of the progress that has still to be done is to complete our historical data, but we're getting there, and we have much of it. Sorry, I scrolled there. Sorry. But what we will have in the end is microdata, very detailed for all firms, that covers over 70 years of development. In particular, the most detailed data, including all the information for different plants in the manufacturing modern sector, including prices, is data that goes back to the 70s that we already have, to the 1970s, and covers all the way to the 2020s. We also have household surveys that cover all of the informal sector, as well as employers and employees in the modern sectors, that allows us to also look at firm size. And this is the part that we know we already have, is available since the 1970s, but we haven't been able to finish reading the tapes. So we, of course, relate to several branches of the literature. We're mostly relating to now to more macro literature, but rather than going into detail, let me just point that our contributions have to do with, first, relative to these literatures, putting together the traditional misallocation model of modern firms with a model of occupational choice, and quantifying this with the very rich data that I was mentioning, that allows us to cover all of the employment and not only focus on self-employment or micro-enterprises as much as the development literature does, nor on the more modern firms as much as the misallocation literature does. Methodologically, we also contribute in two particular senses beyond this use of this very rich data. One is the fact that our productivity measures are linked back to the ability of the population, and we do that in two different dimensions. So talent and productivity is not unidimensional here, but we differentiate between talent for any production versus talent for the modern production in particular. And that will reproduce some features of the data that cannot be reproduced otherwise. And also, with respect to the misallocation literature, we sort of bridge part of the literature where the distortions are simply black boxes, wedges, with part of the literature where the distortions are particular regulations, but we put the two together. And so we have some particular regulations, in particular in the labor market, but we also allow for wedges so that we can let different stories compete. So
Marcela, this is probably a good moment to ask a question that Liliana posted, which is on alternative stories. And so the question is whether technological progress making labor-saving production technologies available for late starters could be an alternative explanation for the results.
So we will estimate the parameters of the production function of the modern technologies. And that means that if what we have is differential elasticities compared to other economies, which we don't have here, we only have Colombia, the fact that technology is labor saving would be estimated. So that's in there. Still, we are taking, so one thing we're doing is informing our estimation with actual productivity distributions. And so that means that we're basically examining how much the misallocation that arises here, misallocation both within the modern sector across firms and also between informality and modernity. We're examining what's the potential of that. And let me just say, to start with, we find that it has a lot of potential, but it doesn't fully explain the facts. And so partly what has to be going on is things that have to do with differentials in that productivity distribution as well, in the two dimensions of talent that we have, and that's a place we have to go to. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll quickly talk about this Colombian context, the model, estimation and quantification, and some results, which are very preliminary. I still wanted to present this because I think this crowd is particularly interesting to contrast the place where we're coming from with perhaps other views. So let me stress that all of your comments are super welcome. So in terms of the context, not only to show you that Colombia fits these patterns, but also to show you that in Colombia, some of the motivations for the story that some people have put forward regarding social protection apply. So let me just say Colombia is a poster child of the two facts that I was showing. Colombia is sort of right in the middle of Latin America. It's the average Latin American country with a lot of divorce. it has a little bit more joblessness than other Latin American economies, I have to also point to. And it exhibits the polarization that I was mentioning, in the sense that employment within manufacturing, employment in the more modern firms, here represented by the firms of 10 or more employees, is also particularly jobless, whereas value added is much more powerful in this firms of 10 or more employees. The other feature that's important of these economies is, again, the larger, presumably more productive firms are the ones that are more jobless. But then at the same time, those are the firms that are least present in these economies. One interesting feature, let me now bring some information from a different project with Marcela Melendez, a series of papers where we're sort of documenting facts for the Latin American economies. Here, this is for the firm size distribution across different countries. Latin America are the blue dots, and the ones that we're pointing here at with an arrow is in particular Colombia. And what you have here is the share within all employment of self-employment, employment in micro enterprises, employment in SMEs, 10 to 50 employee firms, and here larger firm employment. And the thing that I want to point at is that Latin America and Colombia in particular have an excess for the level of GDP per capita, an excess of self-employment, and a lack mainly of SMEs, not large corporations. So whatever the distortion is that is affecting the presence of modern firms, defined as firms with 10 or more employees, is something that's particularly important at the cutoff of 10 employees. Secondly, minimum wages are very high in these countries compared to the overall distribution of income. So in Colombia in particular, they're close to the 50th percentile of income. This is again from other project with Marcela Melendez, where we're collecting the data on social protection. So Colombia is at the 50th percentile, and other countries in Latin America have minimum wages that are even higher in terms of the position in the income distribution. And on top of those minimum wages, employer contributions per employee as a percentage of wage are also very high. So in Colombia, they are around 50%. That means that you pay for a minimum wage employee the minimum wage plus 50% in addition. And in other countries in Latin America, they can be much higher for some employees, also lower for some others, but still significant. And then finally, the other feature that's important for us to remember is that that there is some degree of segmentation between self-employment and salaried employment, but the two distributions are not totally phased out with respect to one another. So there's some degree of overlap. The self-employed are mostly below the minimum wage, whereas the salaried employees are mostly above the minimum wage. And in fact, this little tail here is mostly for part-time. But there is some degree of overlap, and that's going to inform our estimation. So let me now move to our model. So let me first summarize some features of the model. This is a model where occupational choice is crucial. We have three states that people can choose to be at. They can be a technology operator in the traditional sector, and that you can think of for the data as being any firm below 10 employees outside manufacturing. But you can also more general think of it as the more informal sector. You can also be a technology operator in the modern sector. That's an entrepreneur in modern manufacturing, which in our data is going to be manufacturing with 10 or more employees. Or you could be a salaried worker in a modern firm. The extra thing so we're going to put that occupational choice model together with a very detailed module of the modern manufacturing firms, where we are going to incorporate the fact that these modern firms, the formal firms, have to pay a minimum wage to their workers. They may face distortions to revenue, labor, or capital, and we include the three of them. I'm going to tell you how we identify them, which are different sorts of distortions, different sources of distortions studied in the misallocation literature. And we overpose these two modules. And then we're going to calibrate this model to data and then run counterfactuals that tell us what happens if we shut down these distortions that we're identifying of the data. How much changing these distortions changes joblessness, which of these distortions are important for joblessness, what other consequences do we see on the level and distribution of income, and then looking forward, we will also look into the distribution of size of firms, but that's something that we still need to incorporate. And our aim is to think of this at the peak of industrializations, when services are mostly traditional, and that sort of brings some support to our very much simplifying assumption that all of the modernity is in manufacturing. So here's the details of the model, and in particular of this first module of occupational choice. We're going to have N agents, where N in our calibration is going to be the number of the people in the working population in Colombia that we see in these household surveys. They are going to have heterogeneous ability, and an important feature, innovative feature of this model is that ability will come in two different dimensions. There's an ability to produce called A, and a heterogeneous ability to produce varieties valued by consumers. So this is an ability that's useful anywhere in any sector you're in. The second ability, this is entrepreneurial ability. This is ability to produce something that's differentiated and that will be present only in our modern sector. Each agent will be endowed with 1 unit of time, which is used to either, as I was saying, manage a modern technology. The modern entrepreneur has income equal to the profits of the modern firm, and those profits are going to be a function of both talents of the entrepreneur and other stuff that I'm going to specify later, and in particular the distortions. The person can also, rather than managing a modern technology, manage a traditional technology, in which case his or her income is precisely his or her productivity to produce A. Or he or she can become a worker in the modern sector, where he or she provides A units of effective labor and earns W, a wage, the equilibrium wage, times A. The government collects these taxes that comes from the payroll. In our model, we will suppose that these distortions are taxes. And those taxes can be rebated to agents independent of occupation. And here we're trying to capture that these contributions for Social Security have some benefit to the population. At this point, we're not making much use of this, but down the road, we plan to analyze policies that have been proposed to shift the funding of social protection from these distortions in our model to other forms of taxation. Okay, so let me now move to preferences, and you don't need to remember much detail from here other than the things I'm going to point at. Let me actually start from the bottom. We're going to have this modern manufacturing sector. This is our modern sector. And the utility that people get from that sector is the CES utility, where the important thing is that there is product differentiation. And each product, each firm I, will be valued by consumers with this DI, which corresponds to the talent of the entrepreneur that runs this firm. And then there are traditional manufacturing and traditional non-manufacturing sectors. And all of those are also valued by consumers. So for instance, imagine a consumer that values differentiated product, differentiated manufacturing, but also perhaps buying something produced by her neighbor, a marmalade pot made by her neighbor. So that's non-modern manufacturing. And similarly, people also value traditional sectors other than manufacturing. Modern and non-modern also differ in terms of the technologies that are operated. All modern technologies, as I said, are assumed to be manufacturing, and we know this is an extreme simplification, but the tractability of the data at this point forces us to do this. But again, not all manufacturing is modern. And you have two technologies to produce. One is the traditional technology. You simply produce your A and earn your A, as I said. But if you produce in modern manufacturing, there is a technology that combines capital, labor, and other materials with your productivity to produce. And so here, the productivity of the entrepreneur who owns this firm is clearly identified as something that's useful to produce physical units of product, whereas the D of the entrepreneur is useful to produce value to the consumer on top of the efficiency of production. And we introduce these distortions, which are exclusively in the modern sector, which are of two kinds. One is a minimum wage. Just let me stress that here is minimum payments to the worker. Remember that the payment that the worker receives is the equilibrium wage, W, times his or her efficiency units of labor that he or she is putting into production, which is given by this A. So the minimum wage is established in terms of payment. And there's also these other distortions. We're going to model them similar to taxes, but of course they could be something else different from statutory taxes, which are applied on labor. That's tau L, capital rents, tau K, and revenue distortions, tau R, which may be heterogeneous across models, and we do find them to be very heterogeneous across firms in the modern sector. This is the module for the modern firm, where I just want to point that the firm profit maximization includes these different distortions that I was talking about, and that the utility function for modern manufacturing that we were looking at implies a demand curve such that if you observe P, as we do for the modern sector, and you observe Y, the production, as we observe for the modern sector, then you can deduce D for the modern firm, which is partly what we do. And this problem implies a profit, which is going to be the income of the entrepreneur, which is a function of the revenue, the distortions, and other things. And the revenue itself depends on the two talents of the entrepreneur and the different distortions that the firm's faced with. If the firm pays more revenue taxes, more labor, or more capital taxes, then that firm is going to be smaller, is going to hire less workers than it would otherwise do. Let me point that here, this is our definition of productivities, is a productivity that includes both product efficiency in production and talent, entrepreneurial talent. So with this pie, we can now understand the occupational problem. So let's first forget about the black line here. And what you have here is, this is the earnings as a worker, W times A. This is the earnings as a self-employed, A. W has to be greater than 1, because otherwise there would be no greater or equal than 1. Otherwise there would be no provision of manufacturing, and we are imposing that people value some manufacturing, so there has to be some manufacturing. And so in that sense, everybody would prefer to be a worker in the modern sector. However, because there is this minimum payment that firms have to do to pay to workers in these sectors, only workers with A above this level would be hired as workers, and the other workers will be self-employed. let me now bring the possibility of becoming a modern entrepreneur. This black line here is the profits that you would earn as an entrepreneur. It is for the parameters that we identified is convex in A. And so that means that the higher A workers are more likely to become entrepreneurs. So in this particular representation here, which is for a given D, the least productive workers become self-employed, then the second tranche becomes workers, then the last tranche becomes employers. However, D can change, and so if you were super high D, you had a great entrepreneurial talent, that could compensate you being a low A person. So, for instance, this is what I'm showing here. You have a very high D. That may imply that your profit function crosses with your earnings, with the earnings as a self-employed much earlier in the distribution. And so even if you're a low A person that wouldn't become a formal worker, you could become an entrepreneur because you're endowed with this very high D. And what that means is that you may be self-employed if you're low A, worker if you're high A, but entrepreneurs come from all the distribution of A's contingent on them having high enough D. And what this is important for is to replicate the feature of the data such that there is no perfect segmentation between the incomes of or that the self-employed are not only very poorly talented workers that earn very little. You also have some self-employed that are self-employed because they are modern entrepreneurs rather than self-employed without employees, as these people here. We assume equilibrium, and let me now move to how we estimate and quantify, and we think this is the second, beyond the first contribution of putting together these two angles of the occupational choice and the full misallocation problem for the firm. The estimation and quantification we think are quite novel and rich in terms of how they link to the data. So what we do is we take our modern firm, and as I said, we can estimate the parameters of both the production function and the demand function. And with those, we solve for the distributions of A and D and taus in the modern firms. But those are only relative distributions. So around the mean of the modern sector, how are firms distributed in terms of A, of D, and of taus? That's the first step. Then a second step is we now discipline the overall A and D distribution. So those are the distributions for the overall working population, not only for the modern entrepreneurs, as is the fact in point number 1. And what we do is we take both model insights and data from the household surveys, which are also the employment surveys. And so the first thing we do is notice that in our model, A is proportional to income for the self-employed and the workers. And from that fact and the income in the household surveys for these two groups, the self-employed and the workers, we back A for these groups. And then with that and the D and A that we already had for the modern firms, we put everything together. So we use the A and D distributions from the manufacturing data to project to the population according to the model. So one thing we do is for A, we sort of put together the distribution from the manufacturing data and the distribution from the household. And I am purposely doing this with my hands rather than doing this, because if you remember my figure, what you're seeing is that all of the support of A has both entrepreneurs from the modern manufacturing and workers and self-employed from the household survey. And we use the D distribution in the modern sector, and the fact that the model tells us that all of the people that we observed in the model sector were high D people, and then the rest of people were low D people such that they couldn't become entrepreneurs. And so we use that fact to fit a Pareto distribution from the modern manufacturing and project the lower tail to the rest of the population. And then finally, we calibrate to obtain the other parameters that we're missing. We're missing the phi's. We're missing the uppercase D, which is sort of the scale of the economy as given by the demand function. And we're missing the scale of the taus, of some of the taus, because we only have the relative distributions. When I say the sum of the taus, sorry, this wasn't here, that's because the labor taus we actually observe directly from the data. Okay, so in particular for the micro data module, what we do is we use these expressions here. We run a joint estimation of the demand and the production function, borrowed from my previous work, but for this extended data. That allows us to recover all the parameters of the production function and the sigma parameter for the demand function. With that sigma from the demand function, we back out the D's, as I explained before. So we have the prices and the production for each firm, and so we back out the D for each firm. We also have production and all of the variables in the technology for the modern firms, the production, the use of labor, the use of capital, and the use of materials. And with the parameters that we have, we can back out the A's for the modern firms. So we have these and these. And given that we observe these in relative terms, that is without the large D, and we observe R, we can back out this term here, which is the overall distortion term. It also turns out that we directly observe these tau Ls. We basically, in the survey, the firms report how much is their payroll, inclusive and exclusive of payroll taxes. And so those payroll taxes are our tau Ls. And we also, with that and the labor to capital relation, we back out what tau K is. So we have tau L, we back out tau K, and given that we have all of these, we can also back out tau R. And that's all we do. Let me now finally move to the results with all of this. Here is our estimation for the modern sector. We're currently running it for 82 to 89, separately for 20 and 2012, and then for all years from 82 to 2012, including the period in the middle. We already have the data to go back to the 70s, and we'll do so at some point. And then from our joint distribution of production, this is the parameter for labor, this is for materials in the production function, and then the parameter for capital is 1 minus alpha minus phi. And this is the reason, Karen, I was answering before, that here we are actually estimating how intensive is technology in terms of labor versus capital. The returns to scale and production are practically 1, so we basically forget about these. Our sigma is around 2.5, depending on the period. One interesting feature is that the sigma seems to have become higher more recently. We are using in the estimation 2.5 right now. And this WB means that we are mixing the within firm and between firm sigmas that we have to estimate in the data. Let me show you some very interesting patterns in the modern manufacturing data that we find. One is that if delta is the quality adjusted productivity, then this is only for the modern sector. Then across firms in the modern sector, the variability in delta is mostly driven by variability in D. So in terms of the success of manufacturing firms as implied by the relative revenues, the entrepreneurial talent that we're modeling and that is identified by how much the customers are willing to pay firms in terms of price for a given quantity, this is what dominates. Then secondly, the other interesting features have to do with the fact that these distortions are actually vary across firms, and they are very correlated with the productivity across firms. It turns out that the most highly productive firms are implicitly, quote unquote, taxed in terms of revenue taxes and labor taxes. So that means that these is measured here. So these mean measured directly in the data, the payroll taxes that firms report, rather all the contributions rather that firms report. And this means that the most productive firms are reporting higher, having to pay higher contributions. Whereas these here means this is backed out, as I explained, as a wet. Whatever is in the revenue that we could not explain with the things that we measure is going to come out here. This means that these implicit revenue taxes are higher for highest productivity firms. However, in terms of the capital distortions, it's actually the opposite. It's like the most productive firms face less capital distortions, and this would be consistent with ideas such as the smaller firms facing more financial constraints. Now, this was for 82, 89. For 2012, things are very similar, except that it seems that today the payroll taxes, or in general the contributions on formal labor, are not dispersed, and in particular not correlated with productivity across firms in the modern sector. Okay, so let me now move to the results. Finally, our calibration and counterfactual results. This is, let me stress again, very preliminary. So first is preliminary in the sense that we are not able at this point to inform our A and D distributions with household data for the 70s. That's the micro part we're missing. And so given that these results are mostly for the most recent decade, and that means, remember, these tau Ls are not that correlated. So they're basically fixed across firms. And they're also preliminary in the sense that this is our first full round of results. And so we're still have to go through robustness checks. So our parameters, I already said from where we take them, are tau Rs, tau Ls, and tau Ks are modeled non-parametrically. We basically take from the distortions that we observe, the lowest quintile, the second quintile, the third quintile, and then place them in the firms according to their productivity. So the lowest productivity firms receive the tau R and tau K of the lowest quintile observed, etc. and tau L. We take some parameters from the literature. We calibrate some other parameters to target the manufacturing variable share, the employment share of manufacturing, the fact that the minimum wage is close to the 90% of the median income for the data that we have for this period, and the value-added share of formal manufacturing in total. Here are the results. The results look very much in terms of the occupational choice as a function of A and D, as the picture that I showed you, not surprisingly, but one feature that is still very not satisfactory of the fit of the model is that we're producing too many employers. And this is one of the points where we're saying, well, something is missing. Everything has been measured, notice. Productivity has been measured, D has been measured, tau L has been measured, tau R has been measured. So it's either something missing in the model, or a richer fit of the model to the data that we still need to run to be able to identify the fact that the share of employers is much lower in the actual data. And then, so let me tell you, for our baseline, we basically reproduce the fact that the employment share of manufacturing compared to the value-added share of manufacturing is roughly half. So that joblessness means that you contribute to employment half of what you contribute to value-added as a share of the overall economy. We are hitting closely the 90% target for the minimum wage. And this is actually also close to the data, how the earnings ratio between the P50 and the P5 and the P95 and the P50. But more importantly, let me move to the counterfactual exercises. This slide is called extreme counterfactuals. That's what they are. So we shut down the minimum wage, which is of course unthinkable as a true policy recommendation. We completely shut down contributions and all sorts of taxes, but just to see how much we can reproduce. The most striking result is that you take out the minimum wage and you basically close all of the joblessness that we have. Tau L is also quite powerful to shut down joblessness, but very far from what the minimum wage can do. And both shutting down and just reducing the distortion of tau K improve things, sorry, only shutting down tau K, but just this shutting down the dispersion of tau K helps very little. Let me also point, however, that all of these shutting down these distortions, because it allows the most productive firms to grow, also deteriorate the distribution of income, and shutting down shutting down the minimum wage is not very powerful to increase overall income relative to the base. And last slide, if we run more moderate counterfactuals, we basically find that reducing the minimum wage by 10% still helps quite a bit, but much more is if combined with TAWEL. So just to conclude, let me just say that the extent and heterogeneity of the Colombian jobless industrialization observed at close to the peak of industrialization to be reproduced requires a combination of the different distortions that we're including, but we're still far from fully reproducing all of the facts of the distribution, and we need to bring in other stories. A combination of fixed, that is the minimum wage, and proportional labor-intensive distortion generates very large joblessness. However, we do need additional revenue distortions. In particular, I didn't show you any counterfactual shutting down the revenue distortions, and that's because the revenue distortions are necessary to achieve equilibrium in our calibration. And also, let me also say that full removal of all the distortions that we were able to measure does not generate an increase in income that would anywhere close to close the gap with developing economies. And that's where I'm saying we clearly need to also incorporate the fact that the distributions of productivity are displaced. So that's one thing that we need to include, the fact that the dynamic investments in A&D are also affected by these distortions, and that perhaps part of what's going on is we have low education and low investment in entrepreneurship ability, partly because of these distortions. And as I said, we also need to be more realistic in terms of policy. You cannot simply remove the funding for social protection. What are you going to replace it with? If it's taxes to consumption or taxes to personal income, then we need to look at the effect of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcela. So we'll open up the mic for questions. Laura's been answering questions, and thanks, Laura, for doing that. And so anybody who wants to ask a question live, if you raise your hand, we can open your mic, and we'll start with Giacomo.
Hi, Marcela. Thanks for the fascinating talk. Sorry, I got in quite late. So actually, the question was very much related to one of the last points that you had: dynamic investment in education. So essentially, the minimum wage is a binding constraint if you cannot cross it. But of course, if you can make people more productive, then you can cross it. But then I would think that an interesting counterfactual would have been to sort of think about subsidizing human capital investment, or the A, in your model. So that could be an interesting counterfactual to add into that, because of course it seems like the minimum wage right now is so high that there are very few people that cross that. But this could be changed if you have either. I mean, there's a trap. So dynamically, the human capital could just increase because of tenure, right? So, and that part never starts because you never get employed, so you're never gonna do that. So subsidization or removal of minimum wages at the very beginning of the working life would actually change quite a bit of that. So in a way, what I'm saying is that probably the role of the minimum wage right now is too high with respect to what it could be if we were, to sort of allow for dynamics or things like that in human capital. But yeah, that's that. So you
exactly.
Just,
you're
you
right on
mentioned
target. You're right on target. So it's not the minimum wage per se. So actually, if you look at levels of this minimum wages in terms of PPP, they're quite low compared to other economies. But the problem is, of course, the combination of that minimum wage with the productivity distribution such that it is hard to. Sorry, you hear a ring somewhere? Sorry, that was me. That was my clock. Sorry. Sorry. So I was saying exactly, it's the combination of those two things that matters. You're completely right. Why we're not running a counterfactual of this at this point, just moving the A and the D distributions? One key feature is we're calibrating to the observed A and D distributions. So once we move those two distributions, we need to re-estimate the model. That's basically what happens. So it's not just the counterfactual, it's a full re-estimation. But I completely agree with that point. So if you ask me not for what the paper says, but what is my personal take nowadays from what I see in Latin America overall, I think it's a combination of the two things. And I think actually the one that has the most bite is exactly the one you're pointing at. But I also see the point that given the distortions that we face, the advantage that we can take of any such experiment, policy experiment, as what you're suggesting, is limited. And of course, it will take decades. You're changing the educational system. That will take decades. So I think it's a combination of the two things that we need. And down the road with the paper, that's definitely a place we want to go to.
Just to add, so that the distribution is already picking up the fact that education is subsidized. So primary, secondary, and even university is public. So it could be more than a subsidized issue, a quality issue.
But not in the dynamics, right? Picking it up right now is in a static sense, not in a dynamic sense.
No, I agree. So far, we haven't just done dynamic, but I'm just saying what is picking up from the data are abilities that are already subsidized.
Akiko, you want to come in?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes. So thank you for your paper. So my question was related to the link to the liberalization, trade liberalization, because we know that trade liberalization would also increase inequality across firms within sector. And that these winner firms will hire employees with more skills and with higher wage, and then the minimum wage will not have has a secondary impact. So I would like, because it seems that your first result is so striking in terms of minimum wage. So how can we reconcile this thing about trade liberalization, inequality growing across firms anyway? Thank you.
Thank you, Kiko. So let me first say that we have purposely stayed away from trade. So the model looks very much for a closed economy. We're not looking at all into the trade issue. That has to do with first the fact that this is very complicated already. It has just too many moving parts, which we need because we're sort of running a horse race between different types of distortions. And we still need to bring in what Giacomo was saying. But also, perhaps surprising for many of you who've seen many papers on Colombia related to the trade liberalization. Let me say that the trade liberalization in Colombia in the 90s was an important change in the economy. It did bring many responses, and I have myself studied it. However, Colombia was so closed that this stark change is still not stark in terms of levels. So Colombia is actually a very closed economy. Let me tell you that the sum of exports plus imports over GDP is similar to that of the US and Brazil, which are humongous countries. And so Colombia is actually quite close. And in that sense, we don't think that looking at this through these lens without paying attention to the international trade is such a bad strategy. But I completely agree with you that there's obviously important interactions. We're just not addressing them in this paper. We have thought about subsequent work, not in this paper, perhaps looking at the interaction with international trade.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marcela. Gianmarco, did you want to come in? I'm not sure you do. The baby may be interfering.
And I haven't looked through anything that came up in the chat. So
yeah, Laura has done a great job with those. Gianmarco, go ahead.
No.
Okay.
I had a similar question to Giacomo's.
In which case, this may be a variant of Giacomo's question, but maybe it's not. So on the education subsidization, my hunch would be that over your time period, and definitely if you also can add the 70s, I guess the overall level of subsidy to education must have gone up partly because you have, you know, more people in secondary and then in university. And so can you exploit that to say something about this question? This may just be a variant of the same question.
Yeah. So let me. It's great that you brought back the point that Giacomo was raising as well, because there were, I think there are many angles to these that I would love to discuss with you guys. So one is, remember that we're backing our A and D distributions from the actual data. So whatever is the talent that people are exhibiting through their income, we're picking that up. So if there was change in the education levels and people are now much more educated, we're picking that up through their income. However, in terms of running experiments, I think there are actually, I do think that the dynamics and the subsidization are two separate things. And the reason is the following. The importance of the dynamics is to take into account the bad incentives that other distortions in the modern sector are implying for acquiring education and acquiring entrepreneurial or investing in entrepreneurial abilities. If the modern sector is too taxed, if in fact within the modern sector the highest productivity firms are the ones that end up being more taxed, then that is a disincentive to invest in productivity, because once you're highly productive, you're not going to be able to take full advantage of that. So think of my occupational figure. Let me actually project it. Think of my occupational figure. And add the TAUs, and suppose that the TAUs are such that the highest productivity are more taxed. Then that means that any of these profit schedules is sort of flatter. The highest productivity are not able to take full advantage of their high productivity because they're also more taxed. And so dynamically, that means that investing in becoming more A or more D is not as profitable. And in that sense, it is a disincentive beyond anything that the government does in the educational sector to subsidize education. Then on top of that, you definitely can have subsidies to education. And you're right, Karen, that there has been progress. So nowadays, much of Latin America is basically full coverage in terms of primary and secondary education. There has been a lot of progress in coverage in tertiary education, and Julian Messina and Joanna Silva have shown that attributable to that progress in tertiary education is part of the reduction of inequality observed in the 2000s in Latin America. So there has been big progress. On the other hand, there's also wide evidence of what Laura was pointing at, that the quality of education is much lower. So all of the Latin American kids perform much worse in any standardized test. We see lots of entrepreneurship in Latin America. Chile and Colombia rank among the third most entrepreneurial countries in the world, but the type of entrepreneurship that we have is mostly survival entrepreneurship, is not high quality entrepreneurship. So there's also very poor investment in terms of the quality of the entrepreneurial abilities that we are fostering.
Okay, so we are out of time, but since the talk went a bit late, I'll just if people want to hop off, they can go ahead. Andres, if you want to ask a question, that will be the last question.
And I'm also opening the other Zoom room afterwards. Maybe you can paste the link. Yeah.
Yes. Andres, so if you have a short question, go ahead, and then if not, the Zoom link to Marcelo's link Zoom room is there. You should be able to talk.
Andres Zambrano, I don't hear you.
Can you
yes. Yes. Yeah. Can you speak up a little bit?
We don't hear you anymore.
Lost Andres.
I think it's not to be. Andres, if you can, so if you see the Zoom link that is posted in the chat, Marcela will be there in a few minutes. So hopefully that works to connect there.
I don't see the link though.
Oh
yes,
here. I just reposted it, Marcela.
Okay.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Marcela. This was fascinating and lots of things to come, I'm sure. It's great. Thanks, Laura, also for joining and for answering questions. And hope to see you all soon.
Thanks very much. Hope to see
Bye.
you.
Bye.
I'll be in the Zoom link if anyone wants to
Thank
talk.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.